Hi guys, this is Kumar. In last video of cellular respiration part 1, we have discussed the structure of ATP and how the energy is released from ATP. In this video, we are going to learn about the different stages of cellular respiration and how ATP is produced in each step. So let's start with what is cellular respiration. So cellular respiration, as you know, it's a breaking down of substances to make energy for the various metabolic activities if you're talking about cell. And if you're talking about human beings or the other organisms, they use this energy for various activities like growth, reproduction, movement. So you can say that energy is equivalent to ATP. When we are talking about respiration, there are two types of respiration, and it depends upon the availability of oxygen. So talking about respiration, there are two types of respiration. One is aerobic and another one is anaerobic. So aerobic, when we are talking about aerobic respiration, it requires oxygen and it takes place in mitochondria. So aerobic is plan A, in which lots of ATP is made. And in aerobic respiration, there is a conversion phase, citric acid cycle, which we also call as a Krebs cycle, and electron transport chain, which is also in short ETC. Looking at the anaerobic respiration, so whenever there is a lack of oxygen, there is a production of ATP in the anaerobic respiration. So it takes place in the cytoplasm of the cell. As compared to the aerobic respiration, fewer ATPs are made in anaerobic respiration. And there are two main phases in anaerobic respiration. One is glycolysis and another one is fermentation. So when we are talking about the respiration, the aerobic takes place in the presence of oxygen and takes place in mitochondria, and anaerobic takes place in absence of oxygen and takes place in cytoplasm of the cell. One of the important thing which is here to know is aerobic is really efficient in the production of ATP as compared to anaerobic. So there are more ATP produced in aerobic respiration as compared to anaerobic respiration. When you're looking at the cellular respiration, there are really two important words which you're going to come across as compared to ATP is NADH and FADH. So what are these? These are really important you to know that these are the electron carriers. And in short, if you want to know that, they act like a shopping carts to collect energy that will be turned into ATP during the electron transport chain. So during the two phases, that is glycolysis and the phase of electron transport chains, they get the NADH and FADH from glycolysis and the Krebs cycle. So all those collected NADH and FADH from these two phases of glycolysis and the Krebs cycle, they are transferred to electron transport chain and they are converted into ATP. So let's look at the steps of respiration. So the first step is glycolysis, second is the conversion, and the third one is citric acid cycle, which is also called as the Krebs cycle, and the last one is the electron transport chain. So let's look at the first step of the cellular respiration, which is glycolysis. So if you split the word glycolysis, glyco means glucose, which is C6H12O6, and lysis means breakdown. So in glycolysis, there is a breakdown of glucose into two molecules of 3 carbon, which is also called as pyruvate. And then this takes place in cytoplasm. One of the important things to know here is glycolysis takes place in cytoplasm, and it's anaerobic. So when we are saying anaerobic, that means there is no oxygen. And at the end of glycolysis, the result is there are 2 ATP made and 2 NADH. So remember, 2 NADH, these are going to help in the production of ATP in the last stage, which is the electron transport chain. And these are also the electron carriers. So as I told you that the glucose C6H12O6 that converts into smaller carbon chain. So there is 3 carbons each in those molecules, and there are 2 of them, and that's called as pyruvate. So the glucose gets simplified into pyruvate because you break down the C6H12O6 into C3 molecules, and there are 2 molecules each. So as you can see, this is a kind of a polymer, and that's simplified into a simple structure which is called as pyruvate, which is having 3 carbons. And the net results of glycolysis is 2 ATP is made and 2 NADH. And there is no oxygen in this phase or stage. So next is when the pyruvate is made in glycolysis, if there is oxygen available, it goes for the conversion phase. But if there is no oxygen, which is in the case of anaerobic, it goes to fermentation. But let's look at when there is oxygen required, or there is a presence of oxygen. So when there is a presence of oxygen, the pyruvate enters the citric acid or the Krebs cycle. So the pyruvate is broken down into, let me write down this. Pyruvate is broken down into 2-acetyl-CoA. So that's the final product of the citric acid from the pyruvate. So if you remember, pyruvate came from the stage glycolysis. So it takes place in mitochondria. If you remember, glycolysis was in the cytoplasm, and it takes Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle, takes place in mitochondria. And aerobic, that means it requires oxygen. And if you remember that glycolysis, there was no oxygen. So end product of citric acid or the Krebs cycle is acetyl-CoA. Then the acetyl-CoA enters the electron transport chain. And all those NADH and FADH, they were made during glycolysis and electron transport chain. They store energy, which can be made into ATP. So in electron transport chain, all those NADH and FADH made during the glycolysis and the conversion, they are in the Krebs cycle, they are converted into ATP. So if you see, we had 2 NADH from glycolysis, excuse me for this, and 2 NADH from glycolysis, 2 NADH from conversion phase, and 6 NADH from Krebs cycle. So if I total this 2 plus 2 plus 6, that makes 10 of NADH. Remember this, these are going to be converted into ATP during the electron transport chain, and they are also carriers of electrons. So if you see 1 NADH, they produce 3 ATP, and in the process up to now during the glycolysis, conversion and Krebs cycle, we have collected 10 NADH. So that means in the electron transport chain, these 10 NADH are going to be converted into 30 ATPs. Remember, these were storing or the storage for ATP and which are converted into 30 ATP. So I repeat that again. In glycolysis, 2 NADH were produced, conversion 2 NADH, and Krebs cycle 6 NADH was they were produced. So in total there are 10, and it enters the electron transport chain. And electron transport chain, it is converted into ATPs. So there are 10 NADH and 1 NADH produce 3 ATP. In total it's going to produce 30 ATP. So I'm not going into detail of the stages of electron transport chain because they are really complex. Unless you're in a really high standard or you're studying biochemistry, you don't require that. But only you need to know that there are 30 ATP from these 10 NADH are produced during the electron transport chain. So the stored energy in NADH and FADH are converted in ATP in electron transport chain. Let's look at the FADH. So in the previous slide, we came to know that NADH is converted into 1 NADH produces 3 ATP and 10 NADH were collected during the process, so 30 ATP was produced. We also have, you remember the shopping carts which are going to be converted into ATP. So FADH2 produces 2 ATP and there are 2 FADH. So these 2 FADH were coming from the Krebs cycle. So 2 FADH produces 4 ATP. So in total there are 34 ATP from NADH and FADH2. So let's look at the total count of the ATP production during the process. So in glycolysis there were 2 ATP produced, Krebs cycle there were 2 ATP produced, and in electron transport chain there are 34 ATP produced from FADH and NADH. So in total, the total production of ATP during the process of cellular respiration from stages of glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and electron transport chain is in total there are 38 ATPs produced. So what happened during the conversion after that glycolysis and the formation of pyruvate? If there is presence of oxygen, it goes to another step, that is the Krebs cycle. But if there is an absence of oxygen, that is if there is no oxygen, it moves to a process called fermentation. So let's look at the process of fermentation, which means no oxygen. There are 2 types of fermentation. One is alcohol fermentation and one is lactic acid fermentation, or the lactic acid formation. So alcohol fermentation takes place with the help of yeast. That's how you make wine or alcohol, because the byproduct of the yeast during the process is alcohol and a carbon dioxide. So lactic acid, what happens if you are running a long distance? You will be short of oxygen and your body needs to make continuous ATP. So the backup plan for your body is to produce, as a result of ATP, you produce lactic acids. That's how you get muscle fatigue or cramps. So in humans it's produced, and the lactic acid is produced if there is no oxygen, because you have to make ATP to make your body moving for the other vital functions. But if there is lack of oxygen, the oxygen levels drop down